Hi, everybody. I'm Stuart Stevens, and I am very, very happy to be here with one of my favorite people on the planet Earth, James Fallows. James, thank you for joining us. You know, James, I'm just going to
I'm going to
embarrass
interrupt to say thanks. I'm a big friend, admirer, and follower of all you do. So the pleasure is mutual.
you.
Thanks.
I have to take a moment of personal privilege and embarrass you. Uh, James is what my mother wanted me to be. A most extraordinary career. Uh, Rhodes Scholar, National Book Award winner, was at some ridiculously early age a White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter. He has reported from and lived around the world, including a longish stint in China, which I think is becoming increasingly relevant to what's happening in America now with sort of the
Mhm.
rewriting of history. It's something I really want to get your thoughts on, James. He's a pilot, um, and whenever something horrible happens involving airplanes, the uh, the go-to guy to write like the sensible, this is probably what happened, uh, perspective is James. Been with the Atlantic forever now, and uh, wrote a book that became, well, let's put up just for a second here. Look at this isn't all of James' books. In fact, we put this together, we realized we left out the National Book Award winner, which is like, when that becomes like, yeah, Annie won the National Book Award. I mean, this is like, saying, yeah, and also he's in the NFL Hall of Fame. I don't know what the hell. But he and his wonderful wife Deb uh, have this passion for telling stories that people aren't focused on and don't know. And I always thought the definition of a great writer was to take a subject you didn't think you were interested in, and by the time you're finished reading it, you're fascinated by it, and they tell you why it is. And James has that. So that book, go back if you could, please, Sam. The book Our Town was also, uh, which really profiles different small success stories. Is that a fair way to put it, James? Across.
Yes, and how things look better at the local level than they do nationally. And it's interesting that the New York Times, which you and I often bewail, has been having this series over the last year of 50 fixes in 50 states, which is sort of the same approach of
Right.
things that you haven't heard about that are happening in Idaho or in Florida or whatever in South Carolina. So that was our approach when we came back from China, spending a couple of years seeing smaller town America, including Mississippi.
That, in Tupelo, someplace I want to talk about. And this was also became an HBO documentary, correct?
Yes. Yeah, we
Um,
had worked with great filmmakers there, and it's still streaming on HBO Max or whatever it's called now.
yeah, fantastic. Well, look, James, it's obviously January 6th. I was reading this piece that you wrote about Governor Walz, and you made a point, I think, that, it's one of these things that when I read it, I like nodded my head and go, that's right, but I haven't thought about this in a long time, that there used to be considered a advantage in American politics to understand how government works and to be good at it. Um, and can you? I'd just love to get your thoughts on that and how is it that we've lost that? At least on the Republican side, I don't think we have on the Democratic side.
So I'll say first, Stuart, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be, connected with you again, and you know how much I admire your work and your forthrightness and your adventuresomeness and your literary flair and all the rest. And I'll say two backstory elements to this recent mention of Governor Walz on the occasion of his saying that he's not going to run for a third term
Right.
in Minnesota. One is, as you mentioned, I worked for Jimmy Carter back at the dawn of time, and I started working for his campaign in 1976 for the reason many young people work for presidential campaigns at the beginning, which is most candidates are going to lose. So the people who work for them are mainly, young people with. So I didn't have a job at that time. I just finished at the Washington Monthly, or Charlie Peters was the editor, We were living in Austin, Texas, because Deb, who you mentioned, was starting graduate school in linguistics, and I was just kind of freelancing, and they needed somebody to, churn stuff out for the Carter campaign. So I worked in the campaign, then the White House for a couple of years. But part of the reason, there are many reasons that Jimmy Carter had what is still, I believe, the fastest ever ascent in public life, from 1% name recognition to the presidency within 1 year. Part of it was the chaos of that time, Vietnam, Nixon, Watergate, and all the rest. Part of it was he talked about getting things actually done in government and budgeting and the things he'd done in Georgia and environmentalism and in housing and with race relations and all the rest. And so he had his rough spots as president, as everybody knows, but he focused on getting things done. So that was one backstory that has made me think about governors and governments that think they can do things. The story of Governor Walz, who I met a couple of times over the past 3 or 4 years, is that he was originally trained, apart from being a farmer, as a geographer, as a geography specialist.
When I went back and read your piece, when I read this piece, I guess I'd heard that, but I hadn't really thought about it.
And he went back in the early 80s. He taught in southern China for a year, teaching geography or something. And then when he was in Minnesota and in Nebraska, I think where he's from originally, using geographical tools, including those from this company Esri that I know about, to plan how to protect from floods, and where the housing shortages are, and what kind of crops you need to plant, just all the things where the knowledge of where makes a difference in how people live. And so the piece I wrote was after Joe Biden had announced he was not going to run. So we knew Kamala Harris was going to be the nominee, but she was just beginning to consider prospects as vice president. And so I said, here's somebody you haven't heard about, but I know this guy, and he really knows something about using the tools of public life to make life better. And I saw him get an unprompted standing ovation from 20,000 international scientists when he gave his presentation at the geography conference.
Famously raucous crowd, I'm sure.
Yes.
known for their standing ovations, crazy exuberance. Those scientists. Yes.
And so I can ask you something back, Stuart, that we know that politics has always been a matter of the person. There's a person who captures the moment, whether it's FDR or Teddy Roosevelt or Jimmy Carter, weirdly at his time, or Ronald Reagan, and conditions of people, whether they're feeling better or worse, and war and peace and the economy and all the rest. And then what this person seems capable of doing. And it does seem to me that until there was a time, maybe starting with Newt Gingrich, when the Republicans threw the switch that it was just going to be all about culture war. Is that a fair reading of when it became all culture war and not delivering the goods? You are the expert on this.
Yeah. God, I wish I wasn't. I think it's a complicated question because, one of the criticisms of Mitt Romney, who I work for, and we lost, by the way.
Which is how we first met, when Deb and I were reporting on your campaign.
And, one of the criticisms Mitt got, particularly, I think, from the right, was that he was a technocrat, that he was a guy that was running on a platform of competence versus ideology. And there was a lot of truth to that, in that, Mitt is someone who has been extraordinarily successful in different situations at helping take something that's broken and fixing it, which is what he did with the Massachusetts health system, which, is a success story. He was always careful to point out, though it didn't seem to matter, that as a model for Obamacare, Massachusetts is a unique state. What works in Massachusetts, this wealthy small state, it may not work in Texas, and it's difficult to do a blueprint. But Mitt, when he ran in 2008, one of his standard sort of smallish gathering stump speeches was he would do a whiteboard. Mm-hmm. the first time I saw it was up in New Hampshire. I thought it was, the goddamnest thing I'd ever seen. Like, what is this guy? He's up there like a whiteboard, like we were at, some McKinsey, Bain meeting.
Yep.
And I know that he picked Paul Ryan because he thought that, for good reason, that Paul understood how Congress worked, which, he never served in Congress. And he thought, this is someone I'd like to govern with. But then, has there ever been such a change from Mitt Romney, a party that nominates Mitt Romney, that then nominates Donald Trump? And, my analysis of this was that sort of it just exposes the fraudulent nature of American conservatism, that it never really became a governing philosophy that was applicable in practice. And when Bush ran, there's a lot to be said. I think that Republicans were in a situation where Bush 43, where crime, welfare, and taxes had been sort of a mantra, but crime was way down by 2000. Taxes were down. Clinton, ended welfare as we know it.
Yeah.
Cold War was over, and I think that there's something to be said that Republicans really were at loss, adrift sort of why is it that we exist as a party? And this is when Bush started talking about compassionate conservatism. And, people forget, not that they should really remember, but, Bush got a lot of criticism from the right about that, because they would say, trying to say that being conservative is compassionate. And his basic answer was yes. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And, what did that mean? For him, it was mainly focused on the issue that he knew the most about and cared most, was education. So, there's sort of an interesting parlor game among a bunch of us who work for Bush. What would he have been like if he hadn't become a wartime president? I mean, the one big piece of legislation he passed was No Child Left Behind, which, I'm not an education savant, policy savant. I don't know if it's a good thing, a bad thing, but there's that famous picture of him signing it with Ted Kennedy over his right shoulder.
Yeah.
That would be submitted now like in a war crimes tribunal, in the Republican Party. Like, I have proof here. So I think it was as I said, I think that Donald Trump didn't change the party, he revealed the party.
Yeah.
Now, Democrats, I think have suffered from not, particularly in recent years, well, you could say going back to Dukakis, not being able to make a passionate enough argument to connect policy with emotion.
Yeah. So when you look back on that 88 election, when we were living in Japan, so we weren't here firsthand, but think of the first George Bush versus Dukakis as sort of there's never been sort of a greater clash of the expertise guys than those two. The first George Bush, who was, just so experienced, and Dukakis, whose whole message was competence, and having the subways and, the metro in Boston run on time, and riding the T himself. So sorry, it's almost an unrecognizable country from that election, as you know.
Yeah, look, on the internet, as we exist at this moment, there is a piece of video from the 1980 Republican presidential nominating campaign when George Bush is in a debate in Texas with Ronald Reagan, and they are arguing over who is more liberal on immigration. Each trying to prove that they were more liberal. You watch it and it's like something from a lost civilization. It's like you stumbled across something like from the Mayans, human sacrifice. But that's
So I'm going to become the journalist interviewer here again. Here's something I wonder as a Californian myself. I grew up in Southern California, small town Southern California. As you know, California politics was sort of set permanently against the Republicans, apparently with Pete Wilson and the
Yeah,
Prop 87 or whatever it was, for anti-immigration. Why is that not happening on the national level to the Republicans of just becoming sort of untouchable because they were so extreme on immigration, or will it happen to the Republicans?
Well, first, let's just kind of set that up for people. So, in
Yeah.
1994, Pete Wilson was running for re-election in California, and he ran this famous ad called showing people, Mexicans, whomever, crawling over what was in the
Yeah.
border wall, and it opened up. They keep coming. And it really was a precursor to what
Mhm.
Trump ran on. So at the same time in 1994, George Bush was running for governor of Texas, and he couldn't have been more inviting to Hispanics.
Mhm.
I mean, there is a cultural difference in Texas, as you know, living in Austin. I mean, we have a Tex-Mex culture. You have
Yeah.
so many families. You'll have a father-in-law who lives in Mexico. I mean, it's just, it is different there. But as a result, since 1994, no Republican not named Schwarzenegger can win in California, and no Republican can lose in Texas.
No.
Now, that's not the only reason, but it's a fascinating study. And this goes back to the Walz thing too, because I think that it is a tragedy that Harris and Walz lost. That happens in politics.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. Somebody has to lose. I mean, that's the whole essence of democracy.
Yeah.
But because you lost doesn't mean that you were wrong. And one of my frustrations with the Democratic Party has been this sort of, well, we lost, therefore, we need to have 200 focus groups about how to connect with men or something, but they lost that election because the right track of the country was at 27. No incumbent parties lost if it was under 45.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden's approval was 40. No incumbent parties ever gotten 2. So it was a perfect party for a challenger. So a perfect election for a challenger to win. And we know, like Nikki Haley, polls show her doing better than and that coalition that existed for that one day, I think, was just a Fabergé egg, because he did do better with Hispanics. He got up to the low 40s, which is kind of the high watermark we got with Bush. But you knew that couldn't sustain if they were going to follow through with what Stephen Miller wanted to do. And here we are a year later, and we just had an election in November, and Republicans fell back down to maybe 31% with Hispanics. 1964, Goldwater got 7% of the African American vote. You had a Republican nominee for governor in Virginia who happened to be African American, and she got 7%. Yeah. That's pretty much like a flat line. I just my question, for you, James, is do you think we've reached a point where this is unrecoverable as a country?
So let me buy 30 seconds of thinking time with an indirect answer, which is in journalism, I feel as if the question I've always been dealing with is, can the U.S. make it? I was a kid. I was in high school during the Vietnam War. I was in college when things were just flying apart with the assassinations of King and Kennedy and just everything going to hell. In 1970s, when I was working for Carter, things were going to hell. And there's been always, I think, this contingent question of, is it too much for the U.S. now? And we've learned, and politicians have learned to say, and people who are old like me have learned to think that there is always more resiliency to the US than you think. But the institutional destruction now is different from anything else in my lifetime. I wrote a piece a number of times during the first, I'll just filibuster for a second more. During Trump's first time and the first few months of his second time, I wrote often saying, I've seen worse than this, because I was alive in 1968. And that was really sort of a nadir of the post-Civil War US. Now I think in terms of institutional damage, we have seen worse. But I think we're seeing pushback too. And the question is whether we'll ever see anything out of Republicans in the legislature and the Supreme Court. I think so. I have believed in the U.S. resilience, but its institutions are more damaged now than in my long previous lifetime.
Yeah, I don't, the whole premise of "Make America Great Again," which is a phrase that others had used. I mean, Clinton, I think, used it as well. Clinton used it.
Yeah, Reagan used it. I had it as the subtitle of a book.
Oh, you do?
After I lived in Japan, I wrote a book saying that people were saying America should be more like Japan. I was saying, no, we should be more like us. The title was "More Like Us, Making America Great Again." This was in 1981. But Reagan had used it before then too, and many other people. But sorry, I interrupted.
It's one of these things where context matters. Right? In Trump's case, it basically is some sort of mythical 50s, where if you were driven by race, if you were white, you knew that you had a certain place in the world, and that's been threatened. But it wasn't that long ago. Republicans like to nominate big state governors because we would say that states were the laboratory of ideas.
Yep.
And, there was a brief moment. I mean, you could hold your breath when the Heritage Foundation actually had interesting people who would argue over policy working for them before they became a white nationalist Russian-funded front, which is what they are.
So I'll give you another unasked for theory of American history, which is essentially everything since the beginning has been this tension between idealism and resentment, possibility and hatred. And it's sort of that yin and yang balance that goes back and forth. And this is, there are candidates who mainly have this hopeful message, and there are candidates who mainly have this angry message. And you and I have talked over ever since the Romney campaign against Obama about this balance in American life, including in last year's election, where I think both you and I believed that the resentment quotient finally would be a little less than the hope quotient. And that's always the question for the U.S., whether there are more of us than of them, whether there's more people who think there is a kind of American prospect and ideal than who are just driven by resentment, which I think is the main motivation of the Trump Stephen Miller group and Vought Russell group. So that's my theory. We're a country that is in the sort of yin and yang sine wave of the hope versus resentment. And I hope that the hopeful note will come up, but also with a tough message, as we're seeing from Senator Kelly, for example.
Yeah, in fact, let's run. Sam, could you run this clip of Senator Kelly's response
for you? How many generations of Donald Trump's family have served in the military? 0. Now, for me and my family, service to our country is in my blood. My great-grandfather served in the U.S. Navy after immigrating from Ireland. Both of my grandfathers served during World War II. Both of my parents wore uniforms. My dad in the 82nd Airborne, and both of them as career police officers. And when it was our turn, my brother and I started as volunteer EMTs, as teenagers, before becoming Navy captains, pilots in the United States Navy, and NASA astronauts. Donald Trump, he deferred the draft 5 times because he had bone spurs. Look, not everyone has to serve in our military. I get that. But when you're gonna question my patriotism and lecture me about duty to this country and threaten me with a court-martial, 4 generations of service to this country earns me the right to speak. 5 deferments earns nothing.
Yeah, that's
That's how you do it.
yeah. So I mean, when you see that, why is it that Democrats can't do more of that? You know, I mean, that's such a
So Senator Kelly has a uniquely powerful story. You know, how many other people have been combat fighter pilots for the Navy and astronauts, and have their wife be a congresswoman who was, you know, gravely wounded in a gun massacre, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that he, in a way, it's like
and can't be there.
Yeah, and that just as Dwight Eisenhower did not have to puff himself up like Pete Hegseth, you know, he was the 5-star general who had won World War II. Senator Kelly doesn't need to, you know, you have this sense, which I think came across masterfully in that clip of finally you've got him mad. You know, he's slow to anger, but go to hell if you challenge his patriotism. And I think he artfully was trying to say, look, you know, not everybody needs to be in the military, et cetera, but I know what I'm talking about and bring it on. And so I think the bring it on spirit, the yin and yang, I think Governor Walz in Minnesota also had a bring it on spirit. Yes. You know, so I think having, being happy warriors, as FDR might have put it, that's the combination we're looking for. And I think so we're seeing, I hope, more, you know, both of the female governors who won last fall in New Jersey and Virginia have national security backgrounds. So having people who have that tough background, that maybe that's the next wave of Democratic exemplars.
Well, you know, I mean, to me, it's a historic opportunity for the Democratic Party to get back to what they once had. I mean, you know, 1960, people forget. If you watch the Nixon-Kennedy debate, you know, Nixon was on the left when it came to missiles. I mean, he accused Kennedy of having a secret plan to invade Cuba. You know, it turns out he was right. He did. And, you know, Kennedy was, you know, there's a missile gap. We need to be more aggressive. And that was a muscular foreign policy. Tragically, had probably something to do with us stumbling into Vietnam. But it was, you know, the Democratic Party had that strain, that Scoop Jackson strain of very muscular foreign policy. And to me, this is a real opportunity for the Democratic Party to get that back. I mean, it is a true statement that Bernie Sanders is to the right of Donald Trump on the largest land war in Europe.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean,
yeah.
Bernie honeymooned in Russia, but he didn't fall in love with Russia. And it's just an amazing moment. You know, remember when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and you know, the Chinese, like, you know, criticized it.
Can I say something on the Chinese angles? As you mentioned, Deb and I lived in China for a long time. I've stayed in touch both with people in China and people who know about China who are not there anymore. And I think the Chinese leadership right now has gone through a sort of, like the rest of us, a state of unease about Donald Trump. At first, they thought they could just buy him off. If they just gave him deals and money, then it would all be fine. I think now his simple unpredictability has become a cause for concern for them, of just having no idea what the hell this guy is going to do next. And maybe that's conscious and deliberate on Trump's part. But I think, interestingly, a year ago, the Chinese thought they had him in their pocket just by buying him. And now they're sort of wondering about this loose cannon, so to say.
Yeah. And I mean, and there's no greater example of that than snatching a head of a foreign state and not being able to explain why. I mean,
Yes.
I wrote a piece on Lincoln Square today that, it's hysterical. You listen to sort of darkly hysterical. You listen to J.D. Vance. He says that it was because they broke American law. They broke law. There's an indictment. You don't get to live in a palace, in Caracas, and invade American law. It's kind of like makes the whole thing like an episode of The Wire.
Yes.
And we're going to go in and get these guys. And then you had Marco Rubio, who didn't blame it on drugs, maybe because his brother-in-law was a convicted narco cartel Cuban-born drug dealer. But be that as it may, it's one of the more bizarre aspects. The policy that Rubio now is so excited about, these extrajudicial killings, but it killed his brother-in-law, I assume. Good thing. He says that it's about regional dominance, as if this is all like a game of Risk. And Trump talks about it like it's a hostile takeover.
Yes,
like
and
taking over
and it's like a stick up for the oil.
Yeah,
give me your oil.
Venezuela now. We've taken over the board, and we're going to run Venezuela. And I just don't know how many people we're in this America First thing. We're like, yeah, and we're going to run Venezuela on the side. Like, really?
Oh, Jesus. And then there is Greenland, which again, as I mentioned, and we'll mention again, you and I last saw each other while in Greenland. Somehow it has not entered public discussion that the U.S. already has every possible strategic advantage it could ever want from Greenland at this moment. Yeah. There are U.S. warplanes there. There are U.S. naval docks. It is just crazy that this either becomes an issue. But yes, there's Greenland. Do you have any Greenland thoughts?
Well, here's to me, play this out. So would Denmark defend Greenland? I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, they would put military forces in there. So then you have a potential United States versus NATO country military conflict. So how does that not trigger Article 5? So now we have a NATO versus America military conflict, which is like in the wildest dreams of the most crazy people in the Kremlin. They couldn't dream up a better, more delicious scenario to completely, screw the West.
Yes, and just on that scenario, I think I heard this afternoon that the UK and Germany and France and maybe Italy, all the major NATO partners have lined up with the Danes saying and so against the US, which of course means that this will become just I was only kidding, one more of those things that he taking literally and not seriously or whatever the formula is. But you mentioned, in Putin's dreams, this is the wildest fantasy you could imagine. I think that is an interesting difference between Russia and China. I don't know much about Russia, even though my brother is a big expert there. But my sense is Russia actually wishes harm to the U.S. And one of their goals is anything that's bad for the U.S. is good for them. I think for China, they mainly care about China. And if it hurts the U.S., fine, but it's not their main goal. And so I think that China is actually more discomfited by the chaos, whereas Russia is saying, bring it on. What do you think about that contrast or comparison?
I mean, I have to wave my Romney flag here. It was in the 2012 campaign where Romney called Russia our greatest geopolitical foe.
That's right.
And I can tell you, there was no polling that indicated that was like, well, people are really going to respond to that now. It was, in fact, before that third debate, I had this sort of thought, like, does anybody really care about foreign policy? So we polled. And in a national poll, those that thought foreign policy was in the top 10 issues was under 10%. So, I mean, and then I said, we talked about the debate prep. I said, it doesn't matter what you say. No one's going to care. But, he was, I think, regrettably criticized publicly by Democrats.
Yes, I remember.
In the 1980s, he called for their, and he was this was before Georgia, before Syria, before attempted to steal a U.S. election, perhaps with some success. They certainly played a factor in Trump getting elected, according to Marco Rubio's Senate Intelligence Committee. And it's sort of fascinating to me. This was just something that Romney cared about. And internally, we got a lot of grief from Republicans. Like, why are you saying this? It's China. Now, they would hold the line and they wouldn't, go on Sean Hannity and attack Romney. But, nobody was cheerleading for this. Nobody.
Yeah, I remember that very well.
Calling Mitt and saying, hey, dude, this is so great you're doing this. It's like, but he thought it was important to do. And I think that he's just all right.
So you would remember, as I don't, how did Obama answer that same question in the debate? Did he say it was China, or what did Obama say?
I really can't remember. I mean, I think that the goal of the Obama campaign in that race was to present Romney as a Cold War relic who hadn't adjusted to the new realities of what the world was. And I mean, it's a whole separate long conversation, but I mean, I think in many ways foreign policy was, well, it's hard to say. And I think it was Obama's greatest failure, but then you could say certainly God does, multiple times more. It was George Bush's greatest failure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it wasn't,
So, Stuart, can I actually circle back on you for one of my other theories, which is related to what you're saying, which is the role of contingency and luck in how things have worked out for the U.S., that how different the late 1800s would have been without John Wilkes Booth, if he had been 6 inches off in his aim. As you know, FDR, there was an assassination attempt on him before he was inaugurated in Miami. Instead, it was the mayor of Chicago who was killed, and not FDR. How the world would be different if FDR had been killed. What would be the story of Vietnam if Kennedy had been alive? And my sense is that the U.S. has been big enough and rich enough and cushioned enough to absorb this bad luck. But the streak of bad luck that started with the Iraq War and the contested election before that, and has run through Trump coming in the first time when he thought he was going to just go back into showbiz. This may be more bad luck than we can absorb. What is your view on luck?
I think in our system, the major political parties, in part, are supposed to form a circuit breaker function. And the Republicans never pulled the circuit breaker on Trump. And so a sort of interesting, thought exercise, as they say, to go through is, what would the Democratic Party have done if George Wallace had been nominated?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, they wouldn't have nominated George Wallace.
Yeah.
But would they have accepted George Wallace and everybody fallen in line behind George Wallace? Absolutely fucking not.
Yeah.
No. People forget in the 2004 election, Bush didn't declare victory on election night because there were enough provisional votes out in Ohio.
Yep.
Now, I was in the Bush campaign. We knew that we had won, but theoretically, you could say if Kerry got 80%, I think, provisional, he could still win. So, believe me, there are a lot of people on election night that were telling Bush, like, go out there, dude, and claim it. You won. Okay, so we waited till the next day, and then had this weird thing at the RNC, which if you ever watch it on video, it's like so awkward, and everybody just doesn't want to be there. It's like, okay. Yeah. But imagine if John Kerry had said, I won that election. Ohio was stolen. What would the Democratic Party have done? The Democratic Party would have taken its head off.
Yeah.
The New York Times wouldn't have done what, Fox and all these right-wing did. They wouldn't have fallen in line, even though they knew it wasn't true. New York Times would have called for his, to resign from the Senate.
Yeah.
Like the disgrace. So I don't think that there's an equivalency there with parties. And I think that I think something happened, James, inside the Republican Party over decades that we evolved a system that rewarded compliance, not leadership, that you waited your turn.
Yeah.
And you do that for decades. And in part, it was because since 1964, you really were only playing to a white audience.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's an obvious, but to me, still kind of mind-boggling statement. That's true. No Republican has been elected without the majority of the white vote. And I think that's true down to the school board level.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're a company and a major corporation, and you know that your market is a certain section, you get good at talking to that market, and you kind of don't care about the others. So something happened that allowed us to end up with like the Republican U.S. senators we have now.
Yeah.
And I helped elect a lot of these guys, and I never would have thought it would happen. But they, you know, someone like Roger Wicker from Mississippi.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Roger and I were ages in Washington together. Our dads were friends. I worked for Roger. He's somebody whose entire life he's wanted to be chairman of the Armed Services Committee. You know, like when most people wanted to be like, you know, football stars. Roger wanted to be chairman of the So now he is. And what does he do? His first official act is to usher in Pete Hegseth. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say he would not have let Pete Hegseth cut his lawn.
Yeah.
Like, you want this drunken guy with like tattoos and weirdos thing about women around the house? Like, no, you know. And now, you know, and he didn't have to do that. I mean, if Wicker had said to Trump, there's 218 million Americans.
Yeah.
Pick
somebody else, not this guy.
Pick a real conservative.
Yeah.
And if he had done that quietly or had done it publicly, Trump would have done it. He wouldn't have died on the Pete Hegseth hill. So
you can maybe answer a question I find impossible to answer myself. So I personally have been fired from jobs because I was the editor of U.S. News and World Report. I got fired because I wouldn't do something, and that was fine. I went on, did different things. I assume you've been fired or had episodes like this. There are times in life where you know it's not that bad. And how can it be for Republicans who are now either in the House or the Senate, like Lindsey Graham, where getting reelected and avoiding a primary trumps everything else in your life? I just don't understand it on a human level. So you've worked with these people more than I have. Just as people, how can you understand this?
Listen, you know, when I wrote this book, it was all a lie, which really, you know, a lot of people were wrong about Trump in 2016, but it's really hard to find anybody who's more wrong than me. I didn't think he'd win the primary or the general.
Yeah, I didn't either. Yeah.
And then when he did, I had to ask myself, like, why is it I didn't see this? I mean, I was there. You know, there's that trope of books people write about Washington, like, if only they'd listen to me. I couldn't write that. They did listen to me, you know? And I didn't see it. So in that sort of high school English teacher way, if you can't write it, you can't do it. I started sort of writing about this, not thinking it would be a book. But it really came to me, I think, post-World War II Republican Party, there were these two strands. An Eisenhower strand that was governing, sane, boring, and a Joe McCarthy strand. Conspiratorial, often racist, always xenophobic, non-governing. And I think those of us who were around Bush, you know, I mean, literally me, Nicole Wallace, Matthew Dowd, Mark McKinnon, Pete Wehner, Michael Gerson, who sadly no longer we used to all sit in the same room. And I think we thought, certainly I thought, that we were the dominant gene, only because the country was changing so much, that it would have to be that.
Yes.
And, you know, if you go back and you read Bush's acceptance speech in the 2000 convention in New York, it reads like something from like literally another sort of lost artifact.
Yes.
It's all about
like the current mayor of New York. It's sort of
it's all about compassion and humility and service.
Yeah.
And like that guy couldn't get 5% in the Republican primary. So a long way of saying this is, so I wrote this book, and then I did the usual publicity stuff when I went out there, which you've done 80 million times. And I got asked a very simple question on television. It was very early on, like, did you ever think that these people you helped elect would do this? And I found I really even couldn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I like choked up. It felt like such a personal betrayal. Like, no, I didn't. I mean, I never thought John Cornyn. I mean, John Cornyn was a Supreme Court justice in Texas who really didn't want to run for attorney general because he thought politics was sort of, I don't know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, being a Supreme Court justice is intellectually interesting. I think I'm good at it. I don't know politics, but he was sort of talked into running for attorney general. And I worked in that campaign, and we wanted to go out and make ads about, being the toughest sheriff west of the Pecos. And he was like, no, that's not really what the attorney general does in Texas. We deal more like with white collar crime stuff, I mean, we're not, and he wouldn't let us make those ads. And somehow that guy now is a Trump puppet. I never.
To interrupt there, one of our sons lives in Dallas with his family. We were seeing him at Thanksgiving in early part of December. John Cornyn is already running ads. Toughest sheriff west of the Pecos. That he already is doing ads for his next year's or for this year's run.
Yes, I mean it's really, but I think it goes to what I was saying, that the system that we evolved, where we rewarded compliance, and it was like a genetic grooming experiment. We took this field and we bred it until we got a certain kind of, plant. And that plant is a plant.
The plant is J.D. Vance.
J.D. Vance is a compliance, and rather than leadership. And that's how, and I don't see it changing. What
I was going to give you an upbeat point for a moment. I've been trying to talk, and Deb and I have been trying to talk with people and institutions around the country that are standing up and doing things.
Yes.
I think the foundation world in general, led, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, by the MacArthur Foundation out of Chicago. Yep. They've been really standing up and trying to say, we're going to protect our grantees. We're going to try to make up for these the cuts in federal institutions. The federal bench at the non-Supreme Court level has been mainly brave. The district court judges and most of the circuit court judges have been brave. Libraries have been standing up for their communities.
Yeah.
Deb and I met as undergraduates at Harvard. This is the first time in our lives we've been proud to say we went to Harvard, and Harvard is doing the right thing now and is saying, okay, we're rich enough, we can outlast you. We're not going to bend the knee, even though they're making little adjustments. So there are lots of, and people are turning out in the way they've not done before in either your or my lifetime to say, okay, we want something different, for demonstrations on these off-year elections and all the rest. So there's tension in the situation as opposed to just being rolled over.
Yeah, look, I mean, if I were in the Democratic Party, God help us, I would make everybody wake up in the morning and chant, "We're right, they're wrong."
Yes.
There's more of us than there are of them.
Yep.
I don't want to find common ground with the guy in the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt standing in the Capitol. I don't care about understanding that guy. How are you going to meet him halfway? I mean, you shouldn't. I don't want to meet Stephen Miller halfway. I want to arrest Stephen Miller and prosecute him.
Yes. Stephen Miller, to me, stands for the worst in the American experience, and he's the Joe McCarthy of our era, and in a way has more power than McCarthy had.
These badly damaged things. And, there's something here on the anniversary of January 6th that is happening that seems to me to have its roots in totalitarian societies like China.
Yeah,
we're trying to rewrite history. I mean, You saw that firsthand with, they're literally airbrushing.
Yes. Yeah, and let me just say a couple of things about that. I mentioned earlier that the current Chinese regime has gone from being sort of cackling at Trump's corruption to now being a little upset about his unpredictability. But there are ways in which I think there are two very similar points where our time in China to us seems to inform what we see about the U.S. One is the kind of attack on knowledge itself that's happening in the U.S.
Right.
It's very much like the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, where anybody who knew anything, had to run for the hills. And we knew families who had buried their family scrolls in literature because otherwise they'd be torn apart. The other is the erasure of history. If you talk to Chinese people under the age of like 30, most of them have no idea of Tiananmen Square. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know about any of the great famines of the Mao era. And so the erasure of history that we're seeing from the January 6th plaque to the Smithsonian, that is all too resonant with the worst parts of China.
Yeah, and Republicans are silent about it. I mean, we were looking at earlier, Sam, you put up this new White House posting about redefining, and so here the White House is. I mean, this is.
I'm going to put on my glasses to read this on the screen.
Ashley Babbitt murdered cold blood. Mike Pence refused to act.
Oh, Jesus.
I mean,
sorry to say that, but Jesus.
Yeah. Stolen
elections.
This is the kind of thing I wish Democrats would do more. When they were in those confirmation hearings, I would have had every Democrat ask every nominee for anything. Do you believe that Donald Trump lost a free and fair election in 2020? And if you said, well, maybe, no, it doesn't matter. That's it. There's nothing else you need to say. Because once you say that, you're disqualified.
Yeah.
Think about this. The Vice President of the United States was sitting around his office and saw that a group of youngish, not underage, not teenage, youngish Republicans had a chat group where they had like thousands and thousands of pro-Nazi, like explicitly pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic views. So, he was sitting in his office and thought, I've got to defend this.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you've been an aide, I've been an aide. Like, what are you going to say to your boss? Like, I don't know, sir. I really don't know. Like that thing going out and defending Nazis. Maybe we could just talk about that, like internally, like what a tragedy it is that the pro-Nazi side of things is being suppressed in America. But do we really need to go out and talk about it? But he did. So why did he do it? So J.D. Vance, if you told J.D. Vance that he could advance if one of his children had to be offered up for tribute, at the best you could hope for is that he might summon up the courage to say, well, can I pick which one? I mean, here is a guy who attacks the 14th Amendment, who's married to a woman who is American because of the 14th Amendment, who stirs up this hatred against, immigrants and, goes on about heritage Americans. And as children, let me tell you, they don't look like Kentucky coal miners. They don't look like
unless the black lung problem was really bad, the coal dust.
Like heritage Americans do, and that might be a real problem if America had a history of rising up hatred against Asian Americans. Like, gee, that never happened. So
I'm going to tell you just one other thing on if you let me choose which one to give up for sacrifice. You mentioned we lived in Austin when Deb was in graduate school at UT. This would have been in 1973. There was a sort of party for the English department at Austin, and Deb was attending, and there was a speech by William Styron, who was there coming to visit a lecture. And so I said, I was working for Texas Monthly then, said, oh, Mr. Styron, I guess, no, this would have been in 74. What are you working on? I said, well, I'm working on a novel set in a concentration camp about a woman who has to choose between her children. And so this was when he was in the middle of writing Sophie's Choice, and it was still sort of something in his brain. That is something I have that and watching Roger Federer play from 20 feet away at the Beijing Olympics are two things that stick in my mind.
Yeah.
And going to Greenland.
So why did J.D. Vance do that? He did it because he believed, I think correctly, that the way to ascend in the Republican Party is to be the most transgressive and to be proud of it. So, Donald Trump launches into politics, attacking Mexicans as rapists and murderers. All right, well, that's kind of been done. So what are we going to do next? Well, let's defend Nazis. I mean, like, I'm going to really distinguish myself because, you think about other people who might run for the Republican nomination. Are they going to be willing to defend Nazis? So I'm going to step up here and I'm going to defend Nazis, and I'm going to be rewarded for it. And the horrible truth is, in the Republican nominating system, he probably would be.
So yes, and as I say in the improv world, the only silver lining I feel about Vance is that Donald Trump has gotten this far because there's a certain spectacle value to him. He is interesting. Vance is not. People don't like Vance. And so I think, if Trump's on TV, people watch, nobody's going to watch Vance. So that is, you agree or not?
No, I think, look, in many ways, I think politics is a perfect marketplace because people will say and do anything to get votes and people get to do. So when Vance ran for the Senate, he only won that Republican. I worked for the previous Rob Portman, Republican senator.
Yeah.
When Vance took his seat.
Yep.
The only reason he won is because Peter Thiel came in with a $16 million super PAC, which was a lot of money in a Republican primary at the very end, and pushed Vance over the top in a Republican primary. Mm-hmm. So then he's the Republican nominee for Senate, running with a Republican governor running for re-election. And Vance got 400,000 fewer votes than the Republican governor. If you had asked me in a political science, is that possible? 400,000 Ohioans went in there and said, I'm going to vote for the Republican governor, but I'm not going to vote for this son of a bitch, J.D. Vance. Nothing like that's ever happened, what we call an undervote. And so, yes, I think he absolutely isn't. I think if you look at someone like Marco Rubio or Elise Stefanik, who used to work for me one time, if they had stayed who they were, mm-hmm. I would say the same, about Chris Christie, who sadly endorsed Trump. I mean, broke my heart. Had they stayed who they were, they would have standing to try to lead the party in a different direction.
Yes.
They could have been, look, we didn't think Trump was going to be a good president. I didn't think he'd try to overthrow the government. I didn't think that he would go make billions for his family the first year he got reelected. So it turned out to be worse than even I thought. And led some reform in the Republican Party. But they didn't.
And there's nobody left. Is there anybody who stood up to him?
Well,
if Rubio had stayed in the Senate, he could have done that, I guess.
Yeah, sure, there's people. I mean, they've all been expelled from the party.
Yeah.
Liz Cheney.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course.
I mean, it's like joke. What would you do about a Republican Party that didn't have room for a Cheney? It's like, it's how does that happen? Mitt, obviously, is another example, and there is no anti-Trump space in the Republican Party. There's not. I mean, and I think that ultimately bodes very well for the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to go back to politics as a sort of perfect marketplace. So after the Harris-Walz lost, what did Governor of California do? His immediate instinct was to go and try to make some calls with the right. Mm-hmm. On podcasts, he would have conservative figures.
Yep.
And, Democrats sort of universally threw up on his shoes and like, what are you doing?
Yep.
And he looked at this and realized it. So what has he done now? He's gone the other way of attacking Trump as Trump would attack others. And he's been greatly rewarded for it.
Yeah.
Which I think, if you start, whoever can articulate the need in a compelling way that the next Democratic president must hold those in the current Trump administration liable.
Yes.
That person, I think,
yes,
can get elected.
Yes.
I mean, make a case. I will elect a mainstream Democrat who's going to, by example, be a very normal president, and America is going to be so relieved that they'll reward that. Now, I would have argued yes on that, but we tried that. And Garland was very slow.
Yeah.
To go after these people, and it didn't work. So I think like in post South Africa, although it was not really about criminal convictions, but there has to be a legal structure that holds Kristi Noem responsible in a criminal sense.
Yes.
There has to be one that holds Stephen Miller. There has to be one that goes after the Trump family.
Yes, and the Democratic candidate should come out and say that directly. That this is a truth and reconciliation need. We're not going to just pretend, just look forward and not backwards. You need to hold people accountable, as we've done other times in our history, but unfortunately not recently. And if Jack Smith were a politician, the prosecutor, he's been been watching his testimony. So I've been trying to avoid any handicapping of the next presidential race until we get through the next midterms. But Mark Kelly, Senator Kelly, what he's saying is very strong, very tough, and going to take none of this because he doesn't need to stand up for it. And so I think that is the tone we need. Yeah, absolutely. And Trump was going to pardon everybody, but there are state crimes that are being violated every day by ICE. I mean, I don't know any states where it's legal to kidnap and human traffic people, and that's what they're doing. And I think that there needs to be a coalition of attorney generals, which will sadly only be Democratic attorney generals. But just as there was a coalition in the tobacco settlement, some coalition here that we are going to have an organized structure to pick the cases that we think that we can win, and we're going to go in and we're going to arrest and try these people. I think that has to happen, or it will be more likely that it will happen again. I agree. There have to be, any parent knows about, there have to be consequences for things. And I think, fortunately, there have been a number of strong Democratic governors. Governor Newsom has been strong. Governor Pritzker has been strong. Governor Walz has been strong in Washington State and in Oregon. I think the new governors of New Jersey and Virginia will be strong. They're centrist figures, but I think they'll be strong. So I think there is critical mass to do what you're talking about. And I think it's going to be about that passion and desire to fight. I mean, there is no ideological structure to the Republican Party now. I mean, Republicans were going insane because the guy got elected mayor of New York and wanted to maybe open 5 grocery stores, and we're nationalizing Intel. It's like, really, and I can't wait to see, Tim Cook, instead of bringing golden altars to Donald Trump, when Trump says he wants 10% of Apple, which is going to happen. Yes. And this is the greatest failure the greatest failure. Okay, a hierarchy of failures. The Republican Party, as you've written, the Supreme Court, as we've talked about, but high tech leadership, corporate leadership, is sort of third, or it's maybe the three in that pantheon of evil right now, of complicity, and the seeing all those tech people kind of groveling to Trump is really disgusting. Musk was an outlier even among them, but the rest of them, Tim Cook doing this is bad. So, not accountability for the tech companies maybe on this, but for people who had political power, like from Kristi Noem on down. I agree.
Well, look, brother, I can't let you go until you promise that you'll come back and do this again. And
whether it's in Greenland or on the Zoom camera, I'm happy to be in touch.
You may be reporting from the front lines of Greenland, the Greenland resistance movement. But I mean, just, you think that because now, NATO has said they'll stick together. I don't know if that to stop. I think that Stephen Miller is going to feel like, well, what really is it really going to happen?
I think Stephen Miller he's gotten what he wants by what he did yesterday, over the weekend, all the preening on the shows of saying, oh yes, this is the American sphere of influence. Actually invading Greenland against the UK, France, Germany, NATO, that's another step. I think even Trump might think, do we really need to do that?
Yeah, no, you're probably right. Plus,
but God knows.
I mean, are American military leaders really going to go along with that? I mean, I just find that hard to believe. All right.
So thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to talk with you, Stuart, and thank you for the guidance you're providing to us all.
Everybody out there should stop whatever they're doing and subscribe to James' Substack. Breaking the News. That's correct, right? That's the correct title.
That is correct. Yes.
And be a paid member. And start reading his books. What's fascinating about it is you can be interested in a lot of different things, and there'll be a book that James wrote about. It's just amazing. So thank you, James.
Stuart, my pleasure, and congrats on what you're doing.
You're why I support cloning. We need more of you. Appreciate you taking the time.
Great. I'll see you.